Child because she's 16, because I'm charging a sexual assault rape, we have a circumstance. Oh, where's the caregiver? My 16-year-old is quite capable of being home without a caregiver. So Department of Human Services are going to back off. It isn't their case. But let's say my daughter is profoundly developmentally disabled, would need a caregiver. So we have a 16-year-old, we have a child, we still have a circumstance, and once again, where's the caregiver? In that particular case, it's my responsibility, it's my fault, I didn't keep my kid safe. Okay, so potentially the charges are going to go against me, as well as possibility of a criminal charge against the perpetrator. From a police standpoint, they're going to ask my daughter, did he hurt you? Heck no, we're in love, we're getting married in 2 years. Law enforcement doesn't have a victim. Okay, but what if I said, yeah, it got a little rough, I hurt. Okay, then they're going to follow through potentially with a rape investigation, the medical center, etc. And so how it's going to be treated is going to depend on who's responding, the 3 C's, the missing pieces of it, what's going on with it. But a lot of times, because my daughter is 16 and is of an age that she really knows the difference and could consent, there's a good probability, unless she's been injured, that nothing is really going to be done about it. These are hickeys that were put on the daughter by the father during sex. Rope burn, father-daughter situation during sex. It didn't matter whether she hurt, whether she could breathe, how she was reacting. It was all about his gratification, how he felt about it. If we're talking about rape, most of us, it even sounds painful, but we also know that it hurts. So we would know some of those indicators. But something that a lot of us aren't aware of is what other indicators are out there. You have a child that suddenly changes their knowledge of sex, the words they are using. You may have a child that steps up sexual activity. You might have a child that masturbates or they play doctor and suddenly they've stepped it up. So it's kind of almost a non-stop process. You can have a child that plays doctor and suddenly they want to see every kid in the neighborhood. It's like, somebody looked at me, I just want to know what it's all about. You can have a child that suddenly becomes very sexually aggressive or seductive. I know an 11-year-old that French kissed her father goodnight. Now that had never been part of a bedtime routine. A kiss on the cheek, a hug, yes. But a French kiss, it was like, where did she get this information? What triggered off a change in that behavior? And so we're talking about a change in sexual activity, sexual orientation with the child. That new and detailed understanding of sex. Now, if we were talking physical abuse and you see a child that's been physically abused, we would jump on it right away. Who hurt my kid? But interestingly enough, when we're talking about sexual abuse, caretakers' parents look at themselves first. Like, what did we do wrong? Who forgot to put the blocks on the computer? What were we watching on TV last night after the kids went to bed? And then when we realize, wait a minute, it's not our fault, then we're going to say, hey, who hurt my kid? And so it's that change in sexual knowledge that's going to trigger you off. You can have a child that's starting to regress. You can have an older, like let's say a 14, 15-year-old that suddenly is buying the candy pacifiers. They're sucking on a pacifier. You may see them babysitting and say, hey kids, let's play house. I get to be the baby. It's wanting to be a younger child. Because if I had been a little kid, this wouldn't have happened to me. If you have a younger child that is incapable of telling you what the problem is, what's going on, you're going to have to look, what is that behavior? I have a grandson that we're pretty sure was being abused in daycare. He loved, very independent little kid. At 18 months, as soon as you set him down, he was off to explore his world. And there was a difference, there were changes. He was starting to have little marks underneath his diaper on his bottom. And they weren't, I personally couldn't even identify them as anything specific. We just talked about where could these have come from. And then the behavior started to change. Trying to change his diaper, he would clamp his little legs together. He wouldn't allow you to clean him. He would clamp his legs together and he would just grit his teeth and shake. That's a change in behavior. When mommy would take him to daycare, as soon as she let him out of his car seat, instead of running up to the door like he did before, he would grab her around the neck and around her waist and scream. Okay, there's a difference, there's a change in behavior. And when you tie all that together, there's a good probability that there was a sexual assault going on. We weren't able to prove it, but it's that behavior, it's that behavioral change that you're going to see. You may see, as far as multiple layers of clothes, that can be fad and fashion. We do layer clothes, but it also could be a protective mechanism. If I'd had more clothes on, it would have taken him longer to get me undressed. This wouldn't have happened to me. You can have a change in bowel and bladder control. And part of that, again, would go with the regression. If I'd been a baby with a dirty diaper, this wouldn't have happened. But it can also be the part of the body that's been damaged, that you can have that lack of bowel and bladder control. And then obviously pregnancy can be an indicator that there's something going on depending on the age of the child. Dentists actually, once again, are identifying a lot of sexual problems and sexual abuse with children and adults. As many as 30% of their female patients, girls and women, have a sexual abuse background, sexual abuse history, and as high as 15% of the boys and the men. And so they're actually able to recognize the fact that there are problems there. And then if you think about the comparison between, and I'm not saying that the dentist is the perpetrator, but think about, just the procedures that have happened in comparison between a sexual abuse situation and the dentist. That the person you're supposed to trust the professional. They actually are going to be, they may even tell you, this might hurt. It's good. We're going to have to hurt you a little bit, but in the long run, it's good for you. And so even sometimes the language that they use, the words that they say to us is, a trigger for someone who has a sexual abuse background. That fear is there. You're expected to lie passively. Just lie still, same thing. You can have somebody, they're touching body parts, and generally, obviously, with the dentist, they're talking about your mouth, your neck, etc. But it's still that intimate touch, that person to person. You develop a trust with the professional. And so they actually are starting to recognize that a heck of a lot of their patients have that background in sexual assault. We're going to talk a few minutes about child pornography. And child pornography is not a separate recognized category of child abuse. It fits in with child sexual abuse. To give you a little bit of background, in the 1800s, girls could actually legally consent to sex at 10. Now, they couldn't usually have a child that early in life, but they could at least be prepped. And that sounds absolutely horrendous. But put it into perspective. Life expectancy in most of the 1800s was 35. And so if the adults in the world are going to be deceased at the age of 35, we're going to have more kids to protect farming operations, businesses, mobility. We're pioneering from one side of the United States to the other. We lost thousands in the Civil War. We had no immunizations. We were losing thousands of people to disease. And so it was a population reason to have a child able to consent to sex activity at age 10. And then remember when I started off, I said that Iowa's child abuse law was written in 1978. Okay, in the 1970s is when we first started seeing child pornography available to the general public. Movies, films, hard copy books. So it was the first time that we were actually seeing it, that people could go buy something that was pornographic. It was available and it hadn't been before. And so that's pretty much nationwide when the trend really started during that period of time that we were having child abuse laws nationwide. In the 80s is when really computers really came in. And in the early 80s, we were talking about room-size business computers, and we were still finding pornographic material in business computers. So we started seeing federal laws on child pornography with computers. We're talking about a big business. We're talking about a daily habit. We're talking about a monthly habit. And I'm not talking about, being online, and sometimes I'm not paying attention to the screen, the monitor, and I look up and whoa, there's a pop-up right in my face. And how did that get there? I didn't want to see that. And so obviously I hit the delete on it. We're not talking about daily habits and when it's that accidental type of pop-up. We're talking about somebody that repetitively goes back to a pornographic site for the purpose of watching and seeing that material. A lot of images. We're talking about, a lot of times we'd say, well, the United States isn't a player in this because we don't want to believe the United States is. But in fact, we're one of the biggest. Part of it is economics, part of it is our ability to world travel. It's easier for us to get around the globe than almost any other country for that. So the United States is a big player in child pornography. And then when we're talking about, I'm not sure why this particular study pointed out Yahoo and didn't point out others like AOL, some of our other service providers. But in fact, unless it's just to say, heads up people, the United States is involved. Big business, $1.4 million turnover a month. And then we're talking about clubs, people getting together for the purpose of sharing pornography. And then the internet came along. Prior to the internet, how could you have a club? Especially something worldwide. You know, how did you know who else was out there? And now we've got blogs and we have chat rooms and we have all kinds of areas where people can go in and for the whole purpose of sharing child pornography. And then we can talk about that the perpetrator generally seeks out and grooms our children. You know, we can have a child that is online, they're in a chat room, and you know there's still a lot of parents out there that don't even know what a chat room is. They don't even know how to turn on the computer. We have some very skilled younger people. They're in a chat room complaining maybe about parents, about their grades, about their social life. Somebody clicks into the chat room. The child doesn't have the faintest idea how old that person is, who they are, etc. And once again, a lot of times the child is into a high-risk situation before they realize that they are in trouble. You may have seen 60 Minutes 2020 exposés where the law enforcement sets up a sting and they go in and they catch a sexual perpetrator. I'm aware of 3 in Iowa, 1 in DeWitt, 1 in Lamoni, and 1 between Denison and Harlan. You know, so we're talking about, you know, different areas of the state. We're talking about for a lot of rural type of areas, and we still had a problem with it. But there are other problems that sometimes we're not aware of. You know, how many of you are familiar with chat roulette? You know, with a roulette wheel, you drop the ball and it runs around, and wherever it goes, you know, that's hopefully your lucky number. With chat roulette, that email message is just flung out into the space of it. And what message comes back, generally, I mean, obviously you didn't choose for that message to return, generally is either pornographic, vivid pictures of sexual activities, vivid pictures of death, horrendous death, corpse, etc. So we're talking about things that our children are involved in that are very high-risk situations. We're talking about children that are into it before that they're aware that they have a problem. One of the cases that I'm most familiar with is a 13-year-old in Iowa that was communicating online with a 35-year-old. Didn't realize until they actually met that he was 35, that he wasn't in her age bracket. That case actually went federal because he took her across the state line. You know, most of us are familiar with text messaging. The newest thing now is sext messaging. You know, sending inappropriate materials, taking pictures with cell phones, sending it electronically, and it is against the law. But our children are involved in these activities a lot of times before they are at risk, and definitely before the adults in their world know that there's a problem going on. As far as sexual tourism, you know, you're not going to jump in a car and just take off on vacation. You're going to do some planning about it first. The same thing, perpetrators are going to plan how they're going to find our kids. You know, every 10 years we have a United States Census. At the same time, we have a state census, a county census, a city or a town census. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you actually can go down, you can go online and do census tracts. You can actually get within 7 or 8 blocks of your house. And the same information that you can find on a federal or a state census, you can find out how many kids live within that 7 or 8 block area of your home. You can find out what's the economic base. Is it a potential of a 1-parent situation or 2 parents employed where nobody's at home protecting the kids? So they actually can tour to really close to our home to find our kids. And then trafficking in children. You know, once again, we would like to believe the United States isn't a big player. Unfortunately, we are. The 2 times that we see it happen most often, one is a natural disaster, a tsunami, an earthquake, those type of things. Because a lot of times in those situations, we have a lot more adults that lose their life than we have children. And so we have a lot of children that are left without that supervision, potentially in an orphanage. And so we have someone with money, and the United States being a big player, goes to an orphanage and say, you know, hey, I don't want to buy any of the kids, but you know, this $300, this $1,000, however much they're offering, you know, this is going to feed a heck of a lot of kids here. I'm going to take the child back to the United States for the American dream. You know, and we may not even thought about that definition, and most people can't define it, but to other countries in the world, the American dream is the goal, regardless of what that means to them. The other time we see it happening is in third world countries where birth control is an issue. Same thing, hey, I'm not buying any of your kids, but you know, this money is sure going to feed the rest of your family. I'll take them back to the United States. And the kids are being brought back to the United States through illegal channels for sexual abuse purposes. They're not being brought back legally. You know, latest statistics are over 800,000 people that are trafficked annually worldwide. 66% of them are children. 50% or 400,000 of them are female. And so it is a problem worldwide. And then mail order. You can go online and you can actually buy a 10-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl. What about a 5-year-old dark-complexioned, brown-eyed little boy? You can actually pick and purchase children online. Mental injury. Mental injury basically means that the child is not functioning at their chronological age. The worst case that I have heard, I wasn't personally involved with it, a neighbor had called Department of Human Services to report that she hadn't seen the neighbor kids lately. So DHS employee went to the house. Mom said, sure, come on in. Mom was a combination of substance abuse and mental illness. The DHS person said, oh, you have toys. Do you have children? She said, sure, let me show you. And she took the employee upstairs to a locked bedroom. When she unlocked the room was filled with cats and a set of 2-year-old twin boys. Now, there wasn't enough kitty litter, food, etc. for all the cats. The place was a real pit. It just reeked. The little boys' faces were pretty clean because just as the cats would groom, they'd wash the little boys' faces. So their faces looked pretty good. Most 2-year-olds have already transitioned from a bottle to a sippy cup, or if not an actual glass. Both of these children still had baby bottles. The milk was spoiled, so they didn't have anything to eat or drink either. 2-year-olds may or may not have started toilet training. These 2-year-olds both had on diapers that had not been changed, and they had already started to have the diaper rash and the beginning of skin breakdown. Most 2-year-olds cannot speak in sentences, but they've got a lot of words. I mean, no being their favorite. Mommy, daddy, cookie, kitty, you know, drink. They have a lot of words. These 2-year-olds could not speak at all. They meowed. Their only contact had been with cats instead of interaction with other people. It does have to be diagnosed or confirmed by either a physician or, and it's generally a master's prepared mental health professional. So you're talking about psychosocial testing. We're not talking about popping into the doctor's office for a flu shot and back out. We're talking potential 3 to 6 months of testing. And so it has to be that they're being tested with it. And so usually Department of Human Services are going to file charges against the caretaker or the parents just to keep the case active while the child is being tested. Some of the things that can cause mental injury: ignoring a child. You know, it's not that validation of their worth. I wish you'd never been born. I wish I'd never had you. How would you feel if that's what you heard? You know, rejecting their values and their needs. That is the stupidest thing I've heard anybody say. Hey, your 5-year-old brother can do math better than you. It's just that constant put down. Being isolated, where they're not having contact with humans, they're interacting with cats. That's going to change the way that they develop. Terrorizing a child. You just wait to get home tonight. I'm going to beat you within an inch of your life. Hey, I'm not going home. You know? I was doing a training one day and there were 10 people in the group. All 10 said that was daily at their house. When they left in the morning, they were told they were going to be beaten, to expect being beaten when they got home. And they said, you're right, at first you don't go home. You know, but then you're going to get it worse because you didn't show up, you broke other rules. So then you just take it until you get big enough to fight back. You know, that's appalling to me. I mean, I grew up in a phenomenal household. To think about being under that kind of a daily threat and putting up with it until I was big enough to fight back. Corrupting a child. I know a felon, and by law, a felon is not allowed a weapon. He owned a gun. He taught his 7-year-old how to load it, fire it, and clean it. His 7-year-old got into a fight with the neighbor kids. He went home, he got Dad's gun, he loaded it, and he took it back to the apartment complex where he was fighting with the children. The dad said, "Hey, way to go, chip off the old block." He was actually programming his 7-year-old into a felon lifestyle. Verbally assaulting a child, name calling. And I know periodically it'll come through on internet as a joke, where the 5-year-old finally started to school. It was the first day of kindergarten before he realized his name wasn't Damn It, because his entire life all he'd heard was, "Damn it, do this, damn it, do that." You know, and it comes across the internet periodically as a joke, but in fact it isn't funny at all. Imagine the damage to the child. Again, in a population, a group of people I was training one day, the guy came up and said his name was Son of a Bitch. His entire life he was called the SOB until he started kindergarten. Grandparents, parents, siblings, you know, the damage that's being done in those kind of problems. And then overpressuring a child. Hey, nobody in our house has ever come home with less than an A-. You know, that's a high bar to set. And there are going to be kids that are going to sail through school. It's not a problem, not an issue at all for them. There are going to be kids that are going to work very hard to accomplish that level. But they're not going to be socializing. They're not going to be doing a lot of other kid activities so that they can make that grade. But then you're going to have kids that are going to say, "I don't understand math. I can't even get a C." They're going to automatically fall below that bar, and imagine the damage. And what about young Olympians? Hey, go for the gold. You know, it doesn't matter. Most of them are not in actual normal classrooms. Most of them are being tutored. They're not involved in normal activities growing up. It's setting a goal that is so high to the detriment of everything else around them. Denial of critical care, otherwise most states call it neglect. You know, this is denial of the basics. And there are a couple key words right off the bat. One is danger of injury or death. Okay, sometimes a grandma will call in, usually it's the grandmother calling. Grandma will call in and say, "Hey, my kids only eat at McDonald's." Okay, at least they're getting something to eat. But in addition to that, there isn't a disease called death by French fry. Okay, they are getting some food, so it's better than nothing. And so generally nothing will happen in a situation like that. But we're talking about denial of the basics to the point of injury or death. Food, shelter, clothing, supervision, physical care, mental health care. All of us have the right to be protected or at least worked through a life-threatening condition. And so these are the basic human rights that are involved. If the caretakers do not have the money or the finances aren't there, then it would not be considered child abuse. You know, and any time we have an economic downturn with it, we see that services are cut, jobs are not available. And so there are times that actually is a valid reason for something happening, and usually not all the way to the point of a very serious injury or death. As far as a legitimate religion, I have never looked at a definition of what the word legitimate means, but basically we are talking about our general religions. Okay, and when we're talking about child abuse, the religious belief usually is the belief of the caretaker of the parent. Legitimate religion, I know it cannot be the Portland, Oregon Church of the Body Piercings. And I had somebody use that on me once. You know, that's not considered a legitimate religion. But likewise, based on a life-threatening condition, if there's a difference between the religious beliefs of the caregiver and the life-threatening condition of the child, the court can intervene on that, and the life of the child will outweigh the religious belief. And so somebody can step in on that if that is a problem. And then as far as minimal versus optimal, unless a city code or a county code has a statement in it that you have to have indoor plumbing, that you can't have an outhouse or outdoor pump, etc. for water, if that code doesn't exist, then you still can have an outhouse. You still can have that outdoor pump. The same way with electricity. We cannot mandate electricity. We have a high population of Amish in Iowa. Their belief is not, electricity is not part of that belief. Okay, so we can't mandate electricity. But say that you have a child that requires an assistive device that is electrical, ventilator, nebulizer, respirator, etc. Okay, then we can mandate care. You know, either you get electricity or we have to find other living arrangements for the child because they have that right to be away from a life-threatening condition. When we're talking about medical professionals, it could be the dentist. In fact, once again, the dental field has done a lot of study on this of abuse of children. But based on that denial of critical care, What we're going to find is, say you have a child that is in need, and I'm not talking about your routine teeth cleanings or your routine well baby checkups. I'm talking about, say, if they have an established problem that needs to have a medical, a dental follow-up. If in fact they are not following through with that regime of care, if the child is not being taken care of when they need to have it, then it could be reported as denial of critical care. So it's going to depend on what is the impact on the child. Is it going to be considered neglect, a life-threatening condition, etc. And so we're starting to see that awareness more in a lot of our medical fields. Presence of illegal drugs in a child's body. There's a couple key words with this. One is illegal. It's illegal for a child to have possession of alcohol or tobacco. It's illegal for children to share prescription drugs. But those are illegal acts, not illegal drugs. And so in this particular piece of the law, we're talking about cocaine, heroin, amphetamine, methamphetamine, marijuana, etc. We're talking about the drugs that are illegal. The other key word in here is child. Remember, by Iowa law, a child is not a child until birth. Okay, so we're talking about from birth to 17. And that's why we're talking about be confirmed by a lab report. We cannot do in a fetal state lab report. We have to wait till we have the birth of a child and then have them drug tested. Some examples of when you might see drugs in a child's body. Let's say mom's pregnant and she's using. Okay, drugs are going to cross the placental barrier, so the child, the infant, is at risk. So at birth as a child, they're going to have drugs on board. I know that in my children, as they were getting married and having other babies, etc., if any of my kids had been using, I would have ratted them out, because you're talking about the protection of an infant. Okay, I wouldn't even have had to say, who they were, because I knew what hospital they were going to deliver. I knew about when they were going to deliver. I could easily have called and say, hey, you can expect a birth in the next week, 6 weeks, etc., that I know that mom is using. And so you can do that to protect the child. And so the child can have actually drug addictions at birth. But then what about an older child? And generally it's under the age of 3, especially we're talking about 18 months, usually to 2.5, when the child is still crawling, still sucking their thumb, maybe with a pacifier. They drop it on the carpet, they pop it back in their mouth, they're licking their fingers, they're doing their gnawing on things. And usually in a drug culture, everything is contaminated. So the child is assimilating, they're taking it into their body, physically taking it into their body. They also can be inhaling it. Because of the fumes of the chemicals that making methamphetamine, but it also can be if the methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, if they're being smoked, the child can be inhaling the different types of drugs, so they're going to be drug addicted. And then as far as one of the most bizarre cases that I've heard as far as drugs within a child's body, there was a pregnant mom, so she was already pregnant with one child, but she had a 7-month-old baby with her. She said that she had been assaulted. So the ambulance was taking her to the hospital to be checked out for an assault. She had the 7-month-old with her in the ambulance, fortunately. The 7-month-old started choking. And of course, the emergency medical professionals were able to respond really quickly to that. They found a plastic bag of marijuana that had been stuffed in the baby's mouth to hide the drugs. And it's a bizarre case of drugs in a child's body. Okay, but we're finding some really weird things happening. One of the newest trends also with the risk to a child is crankachino. Cappuccino, coffee and chocolate, crankachino, coffee and methamphetamine. And so we're seeing children that are actually drinking, they're consuming illegal drugs. Iowa's law does not have a statement that all babies are drug tested at birth, but all medical centers have a protocol. And so when they see specific things happening, it's going to trigger that drug testing. We don't have as many birth defects in Iowa. We don't have as many birth defects in the United States as other countries do. And so when we have someone that does have a birth defect, some type of an anomaly, generally it's like we want to find out what happened because it isn't the trend, it isn't the norm. And so generally if you have birth defects in a child at birth, that's going to trigger off that lab work, that testing to have drugs on board. As you can see, some of the different types of birth defects. When we're talking about skin problems, I don't know if any of you have spent any time around a methamphetamine addict or have worked with meth addicts, but a lot of times they have a problem with meth mites. Now, a meth mite is not a bug. It's that sensation of bugs crawling. It's caused by the methamphetamine. And if I say the word lice, most of us would just kind of go, ugh, like that, just that kind of shiver type of thing, because you can imagine them crawling. It's that kind of a feeling. And so unfortunately, you need to get rid of it. So you actually find people that are scratching, literally scratching their skin, making the grooves with their nails, trying to get rid of the meth mites. You may see pick holes where they actually are picking pieces of their skin out. You know, so it could be with mosquito bites, chiggers, etc., but most of the time it's because of meth mites. It's not a bug. So you can have those kind of skin problems. With dental problems, we kind of have a new phenomena nationwide where we're, usually if you say dentures, you're thinking about older adults. We're starting to see a high number of 25 to 35-year-olds that are requiring full dentures because of methamphetamine especially, more so than a lot of the other drugs. You know, part of the thought process is that the drugs leach calcium out of bones and teeth. Another thought process is because of the drugs and then the munchies where they've got to eat, they're grabbing carbohydrates, and of course they're not doing dental hygiene. So, you know, if there's two trends of thought on that, I'm not sure which one is really official or is right. So if you see, a child that's got major dental problems, it could be Kool-Aid in the baby bottle from the time they were born. Okay, it could be the fact that they're being neglected, that they're not getting dental care. It could be the fact that we're talking a drug addict. So when we're talking about these 5 categories, and you add these 4, for the most part, we're talking about the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. So how many of our kids are being treated for attention deficit disorder when in fact there are drugs on board? Child prostitution. Fortunately, we don't see a lot of this in Iowa, although we do have some cases of it. We see more of it in other states. We definitely see more of it in other countries than we see in Iowa. But it doesn't mean that the child has to actually go through a sex act for it to be reported, for it to be considered as child prostitution. Sometimes you may see an exchange, one adult to another handing off a child going into a motel room. Don't wait till they come back out. Let law enforcement investigate up front. You may see an exchange of money and child. You may hear about an exchange. So use all of your senses and make that report if you consider that a child is at risk. Sometimes we're starting to see them in drug cultures. If I'm a meth addict and I've already sold my car and my TV, what do I have left? I have my kids. And my kids actually are worth more than my car and my TV. We had a grandma in Iowa that was prostituting her grandchildren in a local motel to supplement Social Security. And so there's some really weird reasons for doing it. Most of the time it is for sexual purposes rather than financial gain, but financial gain is also part of it. Manufacture or possession of a dangerous substance. This particular part of the code was written because of methamphetamine in Iowa. And unless you've worked in the industry in the field dealing with it, you may not be aware of the fact that until 10 years ago, methamphetamine was predominantly west of the Mississippi River, didn't cross the Mississippi River. There were very few drug cases east of the Mississippi River for methamphetamines. Methamphetamines west,